Ready to dive into some 9/11 conspiracy theories? Let's do it. We're taking a deep dive today into a fascinating Coast to Coast AM episode. And this one features Don Jeffries. He's an author who's really made a name for himself by questioning, well, pretty much everything.
Coast to Coast AM is like the internet before the internet, Late night radio, diving into all things paranormal, conspiracy theories, you name it. If it sounds out there, they're probably talking about it.
Exactly. And Jeffries is a regular guest. He's got this book, American Memory Hole, and the title alone is intriguing, right? His argument is that some historical narratives, well, they get suppressed, kind of like tossed in this memory hole, while others, often pushed by what he calls court historians, they get the spotlight.
Court historians, it's an interesting way to put it, suggest there are those in power, those who might have something to gain, who shape how history is written.
So it's not necessarily about, like, uncovering literal hidden documents. It's more about questioning whose perspective becomes the dominant one.
Exactly. Like that saying, history is written by the victors, right?
Yeah.
Jeffries wants us to dig deeper, to ask, okay, but what about the other side of the story?
Which feels especially relevant with an event like 9/11, right? I mean, it's been years and people are still asking questions.
Absolutely. And what makes Jeffries' claim so interesting is how he kind of weaves these threads together, these little anomalies, into this whole other narrative about what went down that day.
And some of those threads are pretty compelling. Like, he starts with this idea that maybe, just maybe, U.S. intelligence agencies had some inkling of what was coming but didn't, act on it.
Yeah, this stand down idea, right? Like a deliberate lack of intervention. It's a common theme in conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
And it taps into this fear that maybe those in charge, well, maybe they don't always have our best interests at heart.
Which is a whole other conversation. But then Jeffries gets into the collapse of the Twin Towers, and this is where he really leans into the controlled demolition theory, even bringing up eyewitness accounts from firefighters who say they heard explosions.
It's a detail you hear a lot from folks who support that theory, right?
Yeah.
They point to how quickly and symmetrically the towers fell, which they argue looks a lot like a controlled implosion.
But what about the official explanation? That the plane impacts and the fires, they weaken the steel beams, leading to that kind of, like, progressive collapse.
Right, and structurally, that explanation makes sense. You heat steel to a certain temperature, it loses strength, and those support columns buckle. It's a chain reaction. You get that rapid, pancake-like collapse we saw.
So how do we reconcile these two things, controlled demolition versus progressive collapse?
That's where critical thinking comes in, right? It's not about blindly accepting one side or the other. It's about looking at the evidence, all of it, considering different points of view, and then, coming to our own conclusions based on what we know.
It's like you're putting together this puzzle, but there are some pieces missing, right? And then you've got these other pieces that don't even seem like they belong.
And that's the thing about digging into these alternative narratives, especially with something as, well, as heavy as 9/11. You want answers. We all do. We want to make sense of the chaos. But sometimes the more you dig, the more you realize there might not be one perfect, neat explanation.
Which kind of gets to the heart of Jeffries' American Memory Hole.
Right.
Like, are there pieces of this puzzle we're not even allowed to see?
It's a question worth asking. And Jeffries certainly seems to think so. He's got all these details, like the case of Building 7. Didn't get hit by a plane, but down it came later that day.
Right, Building 7. That one always stood out. What's the official word on that, by the way?
Officially, they say debris from the collapsing towers started fires, weakened the structure. Eventually, it just couldn't hold up.
But Jeffries, he's suggesting a controlled demolition, pointing to how fast it fell, how it just went straight down.
It's true that Building 7's collapse, that straight-down collapse, it sparked a lot of debate. Even some engineers and architects have raised eyebrows about it.
So how do we, as everyday people, not engineers, how do we sift through all this? How do we know what's even possible?
That's where, well, you got to think for yourself. Be a little skeptical. Just because something looks like a controlled demolition doesn't mean it was.
Yeah.
There could be other things going on that we're not seeing.
So we shouldn't even entertain these other explanations then, just shut it all down.
Not necessarily. It's
Yeah.
not about shutting things down. It's about approaching them with a critical eye, What we don't want is that confirmation bias. You go in thinking it's an inside job. Every little thing Jeffrey says just confirms that for you.
Oh, totally. If you're already looking for a conspiracy, you're going to find it everywhere.
Exactly. Got to be willing to question ourselves, consider other perspectives, even if it makes us uncomfortable.
And speaking of uncomfortable, Jeffries doesn't hold back on some of the more controversial stuff, like that maybe some powerful people knew this was coming, maybe even, benefited from it.
That's where things get tricky. It's one thing to question the narrative, another to point fingers, accuse people of, well, really awful things without solid proof.
It's a tough line to walk. And with something like 9/11, where people are still hurting, still looking for answers, gotta be sensitive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
These conversations need sensitivity, need respect. Real lives were lost that day. This isn't just some intellectual exercise. It's about empathy, you know?
So how do you balance that then? Being critical, asking tough questions, but also being mindful of the fact that this was and is incredibly painful for people.
You start by admitting it's complicated. There's rarely a simple answer, one story that explains it all.
It's like they say, truth is stranger than fiction.
And often, messier, more complicated. This isn't always about uncovering some big conspiracy, right? It's about understanding how all these things, events, choices, maybe even mistakes, how they all led to that day.
And it's those mistakes, those loose threads, as Jeffries calls them, that fuel these alternative narratives, don't they? Like that story about the passport found in perfect condition near Ground Zero, the one that supposedly belonged to one of the hijackers.
Right, like how could a passport survive that? But, you see similar things in other disasters. Stuff you think would be destroyed, turns up okay, makes you wonder.
So how do you explain it? Just, what, crazy coincidences, or is there something more?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And I think it just shows how much we don't know. We want certainty, we want clear answers, but sometimes the real answer is we just don't know for sure.
Which I gotta admit is a tough pill to swallow, especially with 9/11.
It is, but it's also a reminder to be curious, to keep asking questions. Be open to the idea that the truth might be more complicated than we thought.
And that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating, isn't it? They make you rethink things, think critically, you become a more informed person.
Exactly. Okay, we've talked towers, Building 7, some of those loose threads Jeffries loves. But let's shift gears to another big piece of 9/11, Flight 93. Jeffries spent a lot of time on that.
And this is where things get really sensitive, because it's not just about the event itself, it's about heroism, courage.
Right.
Yeah, Flight 93. That's a story that really gets to you. Ordinary people doing the extraordinary. Let's roll.
And Jeffries, to his credit, he tackles it head on.
Yeah.
He acknowledges how powerful that narrative is, but he also,
Right.
he kind of pokes at it a little,
Yeah.
Points out things that maybe don't quite add up, details that maybe haven't been fully explained.
Like what? I know he talks about the crash site, Shanksville, Pennsylvania, says there wasn't enough, well, evidence.
Right, the debris field.
Yeah.
He brings up these accounts from first responders. They were expecting, well, more given what happened in New York at the Pentagon. But Shanksville, it was different.
It's weird because I remember the images from Shanksville and it was awful, but you're right, it wasn't the same level of like widespread destruction.
And that right there, that lack of, expected damage, it's fueled so much speculation about Flight 93. You get these theories like, maybe it wasn't a crash at all. Maybe it was shot down.
Shot down by who? The government. This Jeffries, back that up.
He mentions alleged eyewitness accounts, people who say they saw another plane in the area. And then there are these supposedly intercepted communications, hints of a shoot-down order being given.
But that's all, what, hearsay, right? Where's the proof? Did anyone get a picture of this second plane?
Exactly. And that's the thing with all of this. Where does speculation end and real evidence begin? It's easy to get pulled in by those what-ifs, those little details, but without hard proof, you got to be skeptical.
So then how do you reconcile these two versions of the story, right? You've got brave passengers fighting back, and then you've got, well, something else may be happening. It's a lot to process.
It really is. And honestly, there might not be an easy answer. You have to be able to hold both of those possibilities in your head at the same time, except that there are things we just don't know. Maybe things we'll never know about what happened that day.
Which I imagine is incredibly frustrating for a lot of people, especially those who lost loved ones.
It is. We crave closure. We want things to make sense. But history, especially recent history, it's messy. More questions than answers sometimes. More loose threads than we're comfortable with.
And those loose threads, those unanswered questions, that's what conspiracy theories latch onto, don't they? They give people an answer, even if it's not necessarily the right answer. It's about finding order in the chaos.
It makes sense, right? Especially with something as big, as traumatic as 9/11. People are going to search for meaning, for understanding, even if it means looking outside the official narrative.
So where does that leave us then? What are we supposed to believe about Flight 93? About 9/11 in general?
I'm not sure it's about what we believe. It's about how we think. Be critical, be aware of our own biases, question everything, be open to different perspectives, even if we don't like them. even if they make us uncomfortable.
So you're saying there's value in exploring these alternative narratives, even if, in the end, we don't subscribe to them.
Absolutely, because it's in that questioning, that challenge to the official story, that real insight happens, right? That's how we uncover hidden truths, how we become more well-rounded, informed people.
Which is really the whole point of these deep dives, right? It's not about telling anyone what to think. It's about giving them the tools to think for themselves.
Exactly. We looked at Don Jeffries' claims,
Uh-huh.
looked at the evidence, or lack thereof, and hopefully got some people thinking a little differently about things.
Because at the end of the day, what you believe is up to you. But don't be afraid to ask the tough questions, challenge the narrative, keep searching, even if the answers are hard to find.
Well said. Truth is rarely black and white. It's messy, it's complicated, so stay curious out there.